of Canadian society, then you had to give up that status, which allowed you your right to vote in the federal, in the country. But then, you know, obviously they're going to look at that as a form of assimilation. Is that a word we recognize?
Yeah.
No, right. Can one of you explain it? Because maybe you don't understand.
So assimilation is when there's a group that like tries to make another group their culture. So say if the Europeans tried to make the First Nations their culture, kind of thing.
So the assimilation is, at the essence, joining into another culture.
Yeah.
A lot of the history that we look at is it's forced, right? Like you don't have a choice. But something I teach to my 10s and my 9s if I get the opportunity is like, you know, people assimilate in many ways, right? So our curriculum looks at the more forceful ways in which we assimilate, but you know, all of us are here right now assimilating for one way or another, right? You're going to do what your friends are doing, you're going to dress very similarly, you're going to speak the same language, right? Many of us in this classroom, our families likely speak a different language at home. I don't know about you kids, but I know my parents speak to me in Urdu and I speak to them in English. It's just kind of how we have our arrangement. But it made more sense for me growing up to learn English than it did to learn Urdu and to be fluent in this language because this is how we operate. So, and no one really forced that on me. It's just something you have to accept with where you live. So some efforts to get more Indigenous people involved in the voting process, providing voting and ID information in more than a dozen Indigenous languages. So, you know, that part's complicated, right? If you feel very connected to your culture, and I'm sure some of you, maybe your grandparents, they live in this country, but they don't speak any of this language. Does anyone have that? Okay, so my grandma's like that. We have a suspicion she actually knows what we're saying, but just refuses to tell us, but generally she can't speak English. So for her, being able to get some of that resources in her own language, in a language that she understands, is going to be very useful. Interpretation services as well to help explain the voting process, answer questions for elders and youth. Offering special ballot voting services at 115 post-secondary institutions in the provinces. This enabled Indigenous electors to vote while away from their home communities. Right, that can be a challenge as well. If your home community where you're registered to vote is hundreds of kilometers away from where you actually are, then it is undue hardship for you to go and have to vote. Right, like imagine you had to drive 4 hours to vote in the election. Like how many of you would do that? 4 hours one way, let's say. Right, would you spend 8 of your own hours just to go and drop a vote?
Nope.
I'm good.
Right, probably not. Right, it's pretty reasonable to say no.
Yes, I would do it.
Some community relations officers working with local leaders to improve access to register and vote. So a lot of this so far just seems getting people more into the system, integrated into the system, which is funny considering that point we just mentioned about assimilation.
But doesn't Indigenous people have their own governing body?
So they might have their own governing body on their, let's say, their tribal land with their band.
Yeah.
But that's going to be separate to the federal government and the provincial, right?
Yeah.
So if the kind, it seems like the objective of this work is that, well, we want Indigenous people to feel as if their voice actually means something in government elections, right? In elections that govern the country, not just their community. I don't actually know how specifically each of these bands would do things, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, like the point I just raised that, okay, you're still slowly getting them into this new system, right? Is that like a new form of, I don't know, the same nonsense that was going on 200 years ago? I don't know, right? How much of progress do you have to accept and how much of it can you deny? You know, at some point you have to acknowledge, well, where we live now functions in a certain way. right? How many class periods did you have in junior high in your previous school?
8.
8. Wonderful. So what? Yeah, but now you have 4. Now you have half. Which is way easier in some respects, but it might be more difficult in what respects?
Attention span.
Attention span, right? Personally, I don't like teaching 85 minutes, especially with your age group of kids, because it's very difficult to keep, a 14-year-old very engaged for 85 minutes without movement.
The switching classes was difficult last year though, because like having like split classes like back and forth, it was annoying.
8 is a lot for school, right? A lot of junior highs have 6. There's 6 classes in the day, right?
Gotta gather everything up and then move to this class and then go back to that class.
8 is too much.
Yeah.
4 might be too little,
Yeah.
right? To not have breaks in between, right? So what if like one of you is like very like, man, screw this. Like, I'm gonna pretend we have 8 classes. What would happen if you just got up, I don't know, and like now, and just wandered off somewhere and then came back 30, 40 minutes later? Like, what would happen to you? Get in trouble, right? Additionally, like, forget the consequence or punishment. Like, where would you even go? What would you do?
Outside.
There is, you go outside. That's a good choice, right?
I would probably.
Some of you, did you say home?
No.
Okay.
I said no.
Which
I
would
might.
also be a good choice,
I might.
right? But there is no infrastructure. There is nothing, no system built for you to just go somewhere if you're like, well, I still want to use the 8-class system. So the point I'm trying to make is it's very complicated, right? Like, you could look at these efforts and say, well, this is just modern racism. This is modern assimilation, right? Indigenous people who want their sovereignty, who want their own governance, are now being forced, right? Maybe not with guns and knives and threats, but with this seductive offer. Hey, if you want your voice to matter, you got to get registered. You got to go and vote. You got to get involved. And that might work, it might not, but you could make, like, I could make the criticism or the argument that this is a modern form of assimilation, of, let's say, potentially Eurocentrism, although I don't think Europe is alone in now doing things that are democratic, which could really get into the loophole of racism with that as well. It's complicated. This is all I'm trying to say. Additionally, some other work that they're doing is increasing the number of advanced and election day polling stations on reserves. So just contacting people earlier, a pilot project for remote communities with barriers to registration and voting. So it seems like now a lot of the efforts are like, well, let's go find them where they are, register them, and then get them to vote. Which, when you think about it, seems pretty much just as awful as what they were doing in history.